Marcus Thompson never expected his quiet Friday evening to turn into a fight that would remind him why he left the military in the first place. After 12 years as a Navy SEAL, Marcus had traded his combat boots for work boots, finding peace in the simple rhythm of construction work. The transition from special operations to civilian life hadn't been easy, but he'd made it work. Now, at 34, he was just another guy trying to enjoy a beer after a long week. The sports bar on 5th Street was his usual spot. Nothing fancy, just cold drinks and a big screen where he could watch the game without anyone bothering him. Marcus preferred it that way. He'd learned to keep his military background to himself. People either wanted war stories he didn't want to tell, or they looked at him like he was some kind of weapon waiting to go off. Neither reaction sat well with him. That particular Friday, the bar was busier than usual. The local college had won some big game, and young guys were celebrating loud and hard. Marcus didn't mind the noise. He'd been in much louder places. He sat at the far end of the bar, nursing his beer and half watching the baseball highlights on the screen above. The trouble started with 3 guys who'd clearly been bar hopping all night. They were the type Marcus recognized immediately from his younger days. College athletes who thought their muscles made them tough. The biggest one, a guy with bleached hair and a tank top that showed off his gym physique, was getting louder with each drink. His buddies fed off his energy, laughing too hard at jokes that weren't funny and looking around for attention. Marcus tried to ignore them, but they were the kind of drunk that demanded to be noticed. When the bartender, an older woman named Linda who'd been working there for years, politely asked them to keep it down, the big guy, who his friends called Chad, decided to make it a problem. "What's your deal, lady?" Chad slurred, leaning across the bar in a way that made Linda step back. "We're just having fun. Don't be such a buzzkill." Linda had dealt with drunk college kids before, but something about Chad's tone made other customers uncomfortable. Marcus noticed the shift in the room's energy. The easygoing Friday night vibe was turning tense. Still, he stayed in his seat. "This wasn't his fight. I'm just asking you to keep it down a little," Linda said, her voice steady but wary. "Other customers are trying to enjoy their evening too." Chad's response was to laugh and turn to his friends. "You hear this? She's trying to tell us what to do." He turned back to Linda, his voice getting nastier. "Maybe you should worry about your own business, Grandma." That's when Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest. The same feeling he'd gotten in Afghanistan when situations were about to go bad. His training had taught him to recognize the signs. The way Chad's shoulders set, how his friends positioned themselves, the way other customers started looking toward the exit. Marcus finished his beer and stood up slowly. He wasn't looking for trouble, but 12 years of training had taught him when trouble was looking for him. He walked toward the bathroom, hoping to avoid whatever was building. As he passed the group, he heard Chad getting more aggressive with Linda. "You know what your problem is?" Chad was saying, now completely leaning over the bar. "You don't know how to have fun. Maybe someone should teach you." Marcus stopped walking. In the sandbox, he'd learned that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. Threatening women was one of those lines. He turned around and walked back toward the bar, but before he could say anything, Linda tried one more time to de-escalate. "Look, I don't want any trouble," she said. "I'm just trying to do my job." Chad's response was to reach across the bar and grab her wrist. "Come on. Lighten up. I'm just being friendly." The moment Chad's hand touched Linda, Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. It was the same feeling he'd had watching insurgents threaten civilians in Kandahar. Some things didn't change just because you traded your uniform for civilian clothes. "Let go of her." Marcus's voice cut through the bar noise like a blade. It wasn't loud, but something in his tone made everyone turn and look. Chad released Linda's wrist and turned to face Marcus. Up close, the kid was big, probably 6'3" and built like a linebacker. But Marcus had learned long ago that size wasn't everything. The way someone carried themselves told you more about their capabilities than their measurements ever could. "What did you say, old man?" Chad straightened up, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate Marcus. "I said let go of her." Marcus's voice remained calm, but those who knew what to look for could see the subtle shift in his posture. His feet spread slightly, his hands relaxed at his sides. "She asked you nicely to keep it down. That should have been the end of it." Chad looked Marcus up and down and apparently didn't like what he saw. Here was a guy in his 30s, average height, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt. Nothing immediately intimidating about him. Chad's friends moved closer, sensing an opportunity to show off for the bar full of people. "You got a problem with how I talk to people?" Chad stepped closer to Marcus. Close enough that Marcus could smell the alcohol on his breath. "Only when you put your hands on someone who doesn't want them there," Marcus replied. His voice still hadn't risen above conversational level, but something about his calmness seemed to irritate Chad even more. The thing about bullies, Marcus had learned, was that they expected certain responses. They expected people to back down or get emotional. They fed off fear and anger. What they didn't know how to handle was someone who simply refused to play their game. "Maybe you should mind your own business," one of Chad's friends chimed in, trying to sound tough. Marcus looked at him briefly, then back at Chad. "This became my business when you grabbed her." The bar had gone quiet now. Even the music seemed muted. Other customers were either heading for the door or pulling out their phones, ready to call 911 or record whatever happened next. Linda had stepped back behind the bar, her hand probably on the phone to call the police. Chad was in that dangerous space that drunk bullies occupy, too far committed to back down, but not smart enough to recognize when they were in over their heads. Marcus could see the calculation happening behind Chad's glassy eyes. He was thinking about his reputation, about the audience, about how this would look if he walked away from some random guy in a flannel shirt. "You know what?" Chad said, his voice getting louder. "I think you need to learn some respect." Marcus sighed internally. He'd hoped it wouldn't come to this. But some people only learned lessons the hard way. The problem was that Chad and his friends had no idea what kind of lesson they were about to receive. They saw a guy who looked like he worked with his hands. Someone they could push around to make themselves feel tough. They had no way of knowing that the man standing in front of them had spent years learning how to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently. They couldn't see the countless hours of training that had been drilled into his muscle memory, or the real-world experience that had taught him how to read a room and assess multiple opponents in seconds. What they saw was what Marcus wanted them to see. Just another guy having a quiet drink. What they were about to discover was something entirely different. Chad threw the first punch exactly the way Marcus expected he would, a wild, over-committed right hook that telegraphed itself from across the room. In the split second it took Chad's fist to travel toward his face, Marcus processed everything he needed to know about his opponents. Chad was big but sloppy. His stance was wrong. His balance was off, and the alcohol had slowed his reflexes. His two friends were positioning themselves to jump in, but they were hesitating, waiting to see how their leader would handle the situation first. The rest of the bar had either cleared out or backed against the walls, creating a rough circle around the confrontation. Marcus moved with the kind of fluid precision that came from years of training and real combat experience. He didn't just dodge Chad's punch. He redirected it, using the bigger man's momentum against him. As Chad stumbled forward, off balance from his missed swing, Marcus's response was swift and surgical. A sharp elbow to Chad's solar plexus doubled him over, gasping for air. Before Chad could recover, Marcus grabbed him by the back of the neck and drove his knee upward, stopping just short of Chad's face. The message was clear. He could have ended it right there, but he chose not to. "Stay down," Marcus said quietly, releasing Chad, who dropped to his knees, clutching his stomach and struggling to breathe. Chad's friends looked at each other uncertainly. Their invincible leader was on the ground, and the guy they'd thought would be an easy target was standing over him, not even breathing hard. But pride and alcohol are a dangerous combination, and Chad's friends decided they couldn't let this slide. The second guy, smaller than Chad but quicker, came at Marcus from the left. He'd apparently learned from watching Chad's mistake and kept his punch tighter, more controlled. But Marcus had been tracking him from the moment the confrontation started. Marcus caught the incoming punch with his left hand while simultaneously driving his right fist into the attacker's ribs. The precision was surgical. He knew exactly where to hit to cause maximum pain, without doing permanent damage. The guy folded instantly. The wind knocked out of him. The third friend hesitated, finally beginning to understand that this wasn't going the way they'd planned. But he was trapped by the same pride that had gotten his friends into trouble. With both his buddies down, backing away would look like cowardice in front of the whole bar. He tried a different approach, attempting to grab Marcus around the waist to wrestle him to the ground. It might have worked against someone else, but Marcus had been trained to fight multiple opponents in close quarters. As the third guy lunged forward, Marcus pivoted and used the man's own momentum to send him crashing into a nearby table. The whole confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. Three guys who'd walked into the bar feeling invincible were now on the ground, groaning and trying to figure out what had just happened to them. Marcus stood in the middle of the chaos, his flannel shirt not even wrinkled, looking like he'd just finished a casual conversation rather than a 3-on-1 fight. The bar was dead silent, except for the heavy breathing of Chad and his friends. Other customers stared in disbelief. These weren't the kind of quick, brutal fights they showed in movies. This had been something else entirely. Controlled, efficient, professional. Marcus looked down at Chad, who was slowly getting back to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and anger. "You need to leave," Marcus said simply. "Take your friends and go." But Chad's pride wouldn't let him walk away. The alcohol in his system was telling him that he'd just been lucky punched. That he was still the bigger, stronger man. His friends were down, but that just meant he had to handle this himself. "This isn't over," Chad snarled, wiping blood from his mouth where he'd bitten his tongue during the fall. Marcus sighed. He'd hoped the demonstration would be enough, but some people needed to learn their lessons the hard way. "Yeah, it is," he said. "Don't make this worse for yourself." Chad looked around the bar at all the faces watching him. His reputation was on the line. In his mind, he couldn't be the guy who got beaten up by some random construction worker and then walked away with his tail between his legs. The crowd was watching, phones were recording, and his ego demanded satisfaction. He charged Marcus again, this time trying to use his size advantage to simply overpower him. It was exactly the wrong move against someone with Marcus's training. Marcus sidestepped the charge and used Chad's momentum to send him crashing into the bar. Bottles crashed to the floor, and Linda yelped as she jumped back. This time, Marcus didn't hold back quite as much. As Chad bounced off the bar and turned around, Marcus was already there. A quick combination. A jab to disorient, followed by a precise strike to a pressure point on Chad's neck. Dropped the bigger man like a stone. Chad hit the floor hard and stayed there, conscious but dazed, his body refusing to respond to his commands. Marcus had hit him in exactly the right spot to temporarily disrupt his nervous system without causing permanent damage. It was a technique they'd learned for subduing prisoners in Afghanistan. The silence in the bar was deafening. Chad's friends were still on the ground where they'd fallen. And now their leader was down too, twitching slightly as his nervous system tried to reboot. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 2 minutes from start to finish. Marcus looked around the room at the shocked faces staring back at him. He could see the questions in their eyes, the sudden understanding that they'd just witnessed something far beyond a typical bar fight. The way he'd moved, the precision of his strikes, the calm way he'd handled 3 opponents. It all pointed to training that went far beyond weekend self-defense classes. Linda was the first to break the silence. "Should I call an ambulance?" she asked, looking down at Chad, who was starting to regain control of his limbs but was clearly in no condition to continue fighting. "They'll be fine," Marcus said, checking Chad's pulse to make sure he hadn't hit him too hard. "Just embarrassed." The sound of sirens in the distance indicated that someone had called the police. Marcus wasn't worried. The bar's security cameras would show clearly who had started the confrontation and who had tried to de-escalate it. But he knew that once the police arrived, questions would be asked about how one man had so easily handled 3 opponents. As Chad slowly sat up, still dazed and confused, Marcus knelt down beside him. "You want to know why that happened?" he asked quietly, so only Chad could hear. Chad looked up at him through bleary eyes, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Because you picked a fight with someone who's been in real ones?" Marcus said. I spent 12 years learning how to fight people who were actually trying to kill me. You three were just drunk college kids, playing tough guy. The revelation hit Chad like a physical blow. The man he'd tried to intimidate and overpower wasn't just some random construction worker. He was a trained soldier who'd seen real combat, someone for whom a bar fight was barely worth breaking a sweat. As the police sirens grew louder, Marcus stood up and straightened his shirt. The crowd was still staring, but their expressions had changed from shock to a kind of respectful awe. They'd just seen a masterclass in controlled violence, a demonstration of what real training looked like when applied by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The police arrived to find 3 college students sitting on the floor looking like they'd been hit by a truck, and one calm man in a flannel shirt giving a statement to the bartender about what had happened. Officer Maria Santos had seen plenty of bar fights in her 15 years on the force, but this scene was different. Usually, everyone involved looked like they'd been in a fight. This time, only 3 people showed any signs of damage. "Anyone need medical attention?" Officer Santos asked, surveying the scene. Chad and his friends were all conscious and mobile, though they moved carefully and spoke in quiet voices. They kept glancing at Marcus with a mixture of fear and newfound respect. The fight had sobered them up quickly, and they were beginning to understand how badly they'd miscalculated. "We're fine," Chad mumbled, not making eye contact with anyone. His earlier bravado had evaporated completely, replaced by the kind of humility that came from having your assumptions about yourself thoroughly shattered. Officer Santos had dealt with Marcus before during his transition to civilian life. She knew about his military background, and had always found him to be respectful and level-headed. Seeing him involved in a bar fight surprised her. But the witness statements made it clear what had really happened. Multiple witnesses confirmed that these 3 were harassing the bartender, she told her partner as they took statements. The older gentleman intervened when one of them grabbed her. They threw the first punches. The security footage from the bar told the complete story. It showed Chad grabbing Linda, Marcus intervening verbally, and then the 3 younger men initiating physical violence. What happened next was captured in detail, and it was remarkable to watch. "I've never seen anything like this," the younger officer said, reviewing the footage on the bar's security monitor. "Look how fast he moves. Look how controlled everything is." On the video, Marcus's actions were precise and measured. Every strike had a purpose. Every movement was calculated. There was no wasted motion, no emotional response, just professional efficiency applied to neutralize threats. The most telling part of the footage was what happened after each opponent went down. Marcus didn't continue hitting them, didn't gloat or showboat. He simply moved on to the next threat until all 3 were neutralized, then checked to make sure no one was seriously injured. "That's not street fighting," Officer Santos observed. "That's military training." When they interviewed Marcus, he was straightforward about his background. 12 years, Navy SEALs. He told them simply. "I tried to de-escalate verbally. When they put hands on the bartender, I intervened. When they threw punches, I defended myself." The officers found no fault with his actions. In fact, they were impressed by his restraint. Someone with his training could have seriously injured all 3 men, but he'd used exactly the amount of force necessary to end the threat, and no more. Chad and his friends faced charges for assault and disorderly conduct. The video evidence was so clear that their lawyer advised them to take a plea deal rather than go to trial. They also received lifetime bans from not just Linda's bar, but from several other establishments in the area that had heard about the incident. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the local community. The story grew in the telling. By some accounts, Marcus had taken on 6 men, or 8, or an entire motorcycle gang, but those who'd been there knew the truth was impressive enough without exaggeration. Linda made sure everyone knew that Marcus had stepped in to protect her when no one else would. He didn't have to get involved. She told anyone who would listen. But when some drunk kid grabbed me, he made it stop. I felt safe for the first time all night. The incident changed how people in the neighborhood saw Marcus. Before, he'd been just another construction worker. Pleasant enough but unremarkable. Now they understood there was much more to his story. Veterans in the area began recognizing him and nodding with respect. Business owners who'd heard what happened made sure to greet him warmly when he stopped by. But perhaps the most significant impact was on Chad himself. The young man who'd walked into the bar that night thinking his size and college athletics made him tough had received a harsh education in what real strength looked like. A few weeks after the incident, Chad showed up at the construction site where Marcus worked. Marcus was surprised to see him and immediately went on alert, wondering if the kid had come looking for round two. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Chad said quickly, holding up his hands. "I wanted to apologize. And to ask you something." Marcus studied the young man's face and saw something different there. The arrogance was gone, replaced by genuine humility and what looked like respect. "I've been thinking about what you said," Chad continued. "About real fights versus playing tough guy. I realized I don't know anything about real strength. I was wondering, could you teach me?" It turned out that having his ego crushed had been exactly what Chad needed. He'd spent his whole life being the biggest, strongest guy in most rooms, using his physical advantages to intimidate others. Meeting someone who could neutralize him so easily had forced him to examine his own behavior and motivations. Marcus was skeptical at first, but Chad was persistent and genuine in his desire to change. Eventually, Marcus agreed to take him to the gym where he trained and teach him some basic principles. Not about fighting, but about discipline, respect, and when to use strength versus when to walk away. The training sessions became a kind of mentorship. Chad learned that real strength wasn't about dominating others or proving how tough you were. It was about protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, de-escalating conflicts when possible, and using force only as a last resort. Marcus found that teaching helped him process his own transition from military to civilian life. Sharing his knowledge and experience with someone who genuinely wanted to learn gave him a sense of purpose that he'd been missing since leaving the service. 6 months later, Chad had transformed completely. He'd lost the aggressive attitude that had gotten him in trouble and developed the kind of quiet confidence that came from genuine skill and self-discipline. When he saw bullies picking on others, he intervened. Not with violence, but with the kind of calm authority that Marcus had demonstrated that night in the bar. The incident that had started as a simple bar fight had ripple effects throughout the community. Linda's bar became known as a place where people looked out for each other. Chad became an advocate against bullying and started volunteering with at-risk youth. Marcus found his place in the community and began teaching self-defense classes at the local community center. The 3 men who'd thought they were so tough that night learned that real strength had nothing to do with throwing punches or intimidating others. They learned it from a man who could have seriously hurt them but chose restraint instead. They learned it from someone who stepped up when others needed protection, even though he would have preferred to just finish his beer and go home. Years later, people still talked about that night at Linda's bar. Not because of the violence, but because of what came after. They talked about how one man's example of controlled strength and measured response had changed multiple lives for the better. They talked about how real power wasn't about hurting others, but about protecting them and teaching them to protect themselves. Marcus never sought recognition for what he'd done that night. He'd simply seen a problem and addressed it with the tools and training he possessed. But in doing so, he demonstrated something important about what it meant to be a protector rather than just a fighter. The difference between a warrior and a bully wasn't about size or strength. It was about knowing when and how to use your abilities, and more importantly, when not to use them at all.